part of the Monaco Ocean Week, which is a week full of ocean events organized every year here in Monaco. There are more than 50 events throughout the week, so please don't hesitate. Go have a look at the many other things happening and that you can participate in, because there's such a lot going on, it'd be a shame to miss some of it. Now, if you would like to help spread the messages from this afternoon on social media, and we certainly hope that you do, could you please use the hashtags Monaco Ocean Week or hashtag MOW 2024. That's hashtag Monaco Ocean Week or MOW 2024. We have two great panel discussions for you coming up this afternoon. Experts from science, economy, conservation, policy, and business will debate the potential benefits and disadvantages of two ocean-based solutions. The first panel will focus on protecting and restoring blue carbon ecosystems, a so-called nature-based approach. We'll then have a short break for some coffee and refreshments. And in the second panel, we will talk about a so-called technological approach, something that many of you may or may not be familiar with yet. Now, this is ocean alkalinity enhancement, or OAE. It's the addition of alkaline materials, which is basically crushed rock, into the sea with the goal of increasing the ocean's potential to absorb carbon. Now, these should be two very interesting debates, but before we dive into our sessions, we are going to have some opening remarks for this event. Would you first please welcome two of the co-sponsors of the event, the Vice President and CEO of the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation, Olivier Wenden, and the Director of Marine Environment Laboratories at the IAEA, Florence Descoings-Comanducci. Olivier and Florence.
Hello again for the majority of you. For the one who were not there this morning, my name is Olivier Wenden. I'm the CEO of Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation, one of the co-hosts of this Ocean Week. Thanks for joining once again. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, so on behalf of all the Oasis Initiative members, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this event, dedicated to what is, in my opinion, one of the hottest topics today when it comes to ocean and the mitigation of the rising temperature and the rise of the acidification of the ocean, which is the carbon dioxide removal. We start to talk more and more about it in the air, but similar approach is going on in the sea. Why that? Well, the context is as follows. Every day, the ocean absorbs roughly 25% or more of the carbon dioxide that is released by human activities. So it's already quite a great service to humanity. But again, the absorption of CO2 in the ocean leads to ocean acidification, changing the very chemistry of the seas. In parallel, the ocean also absorbs more than 90% of the heat carried by the green gas emission, leading the ocean to warming up, a loss of oxygen, and sea level rise. So the ocean is for sure a victim of climate change, leading to serious consequences for marine ecosystems and, of course, the communities and societies that depend on them. But ocean is clearly also part of the solution and our best ally to mitigate and adapt to climate change. Ocean acidification and ocean-based solutions have always been a priority of the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation. And this is why we launched already, well, a decade ago, 2013, that's when we launched the Oasis Initiative with many partners that were very kindly reminded of by Ginny. So yes, as you said, this afternoon we'll delve into potential ocean-based approaches to help address ocean acidification. So of course, there is, unfortunately, no silver bullet to climate change, and any so-called solution will need to happen alongside drastic efforts to reduce CO2 emissions. We will in particular address this afternoon geoengineering. So the potential to use technology to fix a natural environmental problem. If you were with us yesterday at the MBI, I was the one who said, we don't have time to wait for the perfect solution to exist. I should have probably added to that sentence, as long as we have reversible solution to test. And under the guidance of Jean-Pierre, we will see that carbon removal in the ocean or alkalinization of the ocean is a very very dangerous game to play. We have no scientific evidence so far. So I very much look forward to these two panels this afternoon, and I'm pretty sure it will be leading to great debate with you. But before we delve into the topics, let me welcome on stage the co-sponsor of the event, Mrs. Florence Descroix-Comanducci.
Thank you very much, Olivier. And ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, chers amis, and the Marine Environment Laboratories are truly honored and pleased to support this event today. I see in the eyes of some of you that you may be wondering why the International Atomic Energy Agency would be involved in this discussion or closely connected to this topic. I would like to, start by saying that the IEA hosts the only Marine Environment Laboratory of the UN system. And as such, we are playing a key role in addressing environmental challenges, including ocean acidification, of course, through research, development, the use of our specific tools and technologies. And these tools allow us not only to look into oceans past, but also to assess the current state of the ocean, make pertinent projections about its future, and also by looking into solutions for the ocean and for ocean health in particular. So the Marine Environment Laboratories host the IEA Ocean Acidification International Coordinating Center, OICC in short, and which has been consistently promoting and supporting overarching cooperation on ocean acidification for almost 15 years already. The OICC emerged as a direct response to loud concerns voiced by the UN member states regarding the fast-paced changes in our ocean, in particular the ocean chemistry, and the consequences not only for marine ecosystems, but also for human health at large. The OICC acts as a global coordinator and global coordination hub, and for the advancement of science, also for comprehensive capacity building, and for impactful communication and outreach. Many of our key efforts have been complemented and upheld by our partners, including the Prince Alberto of Monaco Foundation and other Monaco-based organizations under the OASIC, as mentioned by Jenny before. As Olivier duly noted, the ocean, mistakenly thought for a long time as an infinite CO2 sink, has taken an enormous proportion of the global anthropogenic emissions burden since the onset of the industrial era. And this has, of course, relieved the atmosphere of even more catastrophic effects, but also submitted life in the sea to unprecedented risks of degradation. In the absence of a viable and universally accepted strategy to reduce CO2 emissions, many other coping mechanisms have been discussed by the global community over the recent years. Ocean-based carbon dioxide removal has been consistently integrated in the pool of potential mitigation strategies addressing ocean acidification. Blue carbon, ocean alkalinity enhancement represent two of the most intensively discussed options for seawater chemistry regulation in the face of increasing emissions. And welcome today's opportunity to dive into some of their specifics and potential. But we must be mindful that there are many unknown variables in these mitigation strategies and possible side effects on marine organisms, on ecosystems, and also largely understudied and extremely difficult consequences to be predicted. So we believe that this conversation today around these potential solutions is much needed and opportune, and we are enthusiastic to be part of it. So we thank you deeply for your interest and openness to these complex issues, and we look forward to a very productive exchange of ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olivier and Florence. We will now get a high-level keynote speech from Dr. Mallette Mesfin. Mallette is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Ocean, Fisheries, and Polar Affairs of the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. Let's welcome her now, Dr. Mesfin.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to make sure to thank the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation and its partners Oasis for inviting me here today. Over the course of the last 2 days, this has not been a message that you haven't heard and that you don't know deeply. The urgency of the issues that we've been talking about, the urgency of now, and the need for action. When we think about climate change more broadly, we really have a narrow window of opportunity to pursue action to reduce the concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere to avoid the most catastrophic impacts of the crisis, while adapting to the changes that are already underway and those that are to come. We must continue to raise our global ambitions around actions that produce deep, rapid, and sustained emissions reductions. At the same time, the IPCC is clear that limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius with no or limited overshoot requires removing carbon dioxide emissions from the atmosphere. We've heard it already. The ocean is one of the largest natural reservoirs of carbon on Earth, and it absorbs 30% of carbon dioxide emitted in the air every year. So it's clear that the ocean can provide pathways through which we can combat the climate crisis. And today's event will discuss 2 of these solutions. On marine carbon dioxide removal, these strategies can complement our efforts to reduce emissions and tackle climate change. But more research is needed to resolve questions about the approach, including about effectiveness and durability and possible impacts, those that are harmful or beneficial. And I look forward to hearing the discussion and the panelists today on this topic. I'm going to focus on marine nature-based solutions, which we see as critical elements in our overall strategy to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. Nature-based solutions are actions that protect, sustainably manage, or restore ecosystems as solutions to societal challenges. They can provide countless solutions to the climate crisis, and the United States has put nature-based solutions front and center in its plan to reduce emissions, to adapt to climate impacts, and to increase biodiversity. In the marine environment, when we think of nature-based solutions, they're actions to conserve, protect, or restore blue carbon ecosystems. Those include seagrass meadows, mangrove forests, and salt marshes. And these blue carbon ecosystems provide our planet with many benefits. They protect communities from intense storms by preventing flooding and reducing storm damage. They support rich biodiversity, including fisheries that support the livelihoods of over 500 million small-scale fishers around the globe. And they have the potential to play an important role in mitigating the impacts of carbon emissions. Though they occupy only 2% of the ocean, coastal blue carbon ecosystems account for about half of carbon sequestered in ocean sediments. That's why our 30 by 30 goals are important, and that's why we focused on this issue in the United States. At COP23, the United States released a nature-based solutions roadmap, which was an outline of strategic recommendations to unlock the full potential of nature-based solutions. It included 4 priorities that I'll just list now. The first is updating policies that accelerate nature-based solutions. The second is making funding for nature-based solutions more accessible and available. The third is increasing training across a wide range of workforces to support nature-based solutions. And the fourth is prioritizing research, innovation, knowledge, and adapted learning to better provide opportunities that nature-based solutions can provide. However, in order to unlock the true potential of these solutions, we must back up our pledges and strategies with action. In order to implement marine nature-based solutions, it's vital for governments and communities to understand the blue carbon resources that they have and the potential that those resources can play in climate mitigation and adaptation. And to scale up these projects and produce meaningful results, additional resources from all sources are needed. According to UNEP's 2022 State of Finance for Nature, annual finance flows to nature-based solutions are only a third of the investment needed by 2030 to limit global warming to below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And when we think about marine-based solutions, they constitute only 9% of total investments in nature-based solutions. So governments, international financial institutions, and private donors must prioritize nature-based solutions in funding decisions. They must increase the ease of access of this funding, and they must catalyze private investment. In November 2023, the United States announced a contribution of $10 million to the International Development Bank's Biodiversity and Nature-Based Solutions Grant Facility. This facility aims to maintain biodiversity and carbon accounting in its projects and to attract further investment to these projects. We also work with countries to ensure that they have the technical expertise needed to implement nature-based solutions effectively and sustainably. And we must continue to expand capacity building and training for local implementers to develop and manage blue carbon projects. This includes involving scientists, project managers, and economists. To address this need, the United States launched the Blue Carbon Inventory Project to support developing countries in including coastal wetlands within their national greenhouse gas inventories, or NGGIs. The United States is the first country to include coastal wetlands in our NGGI, and we look forward to helping others do the same. Through this project, the United States has partnered with Ghana, Costa Rica, and others to exchange this technical expertise. And finally, I'll just say that as we explore and develop ocean-based climate solutions, we really have an opportunity to do so in a way that's nature positive, which is something we heard yesterday quite a bit as well. So we're not only minimizing the impacts that our activities have on the environment, but we're also ensuring that these activities actually increase the health of the planet. So we come together today at a really crucial time and moment in this most important decade for the ocean, for the planet, and for all of us. And the actions we take over the next few years will shape the future health of the planet for centuries to come. I look forward to the insights of our panelists and the conversation today, and working with all of you to leave the world better for our children and the generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mespin. All right, we're now going to set the stage a bit more, give you a bit more context on ocean change and ocean solutions. To do that, would you please welcome the research director at CNRS Sorbonne University IDRI and the chair of OASIS, Jean-Pierre Gattuso.
Thank you, Jenny. It's wonderful to see so many of you here today. It's a real pleasure to host you. Before I start, I want to thank Lina Hansson at the Prince Albert II of Monaco Foundation and Olga Angelici at the IAEA for helping and, in fact, doing all the work to organize this event. So thank you very much to you and to your colleagues at IAEA and FPA too. So setting the scene, briefly, in 10 minutes, that's quite a challenge. So I'll be brief, of course, and perhaps we start with the Paris Agreement, which was obviously a great success to bring together all those countries around a global agreement to hold the increase in temperature to 1.5 or 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial values. Big challenge, and now we discover that it is easier said than done. And this Paris Agreement also emphasized the need to have a balance between greenhouse gases sinks and sources. So in fact, in the Paris Agreement, embedded in the Paris Agreement, carbon dioxide removal was already there in 2015. And this concept of net zero is an essential element, and there are many political pledges have been done to reach net zero by the middle of the century. If we look at emissions of greenhouse gases, what you see on top of the graph in reddish colors are emissions, the added greenhouse gases. So the red line is the gross emissions, and then you have the dotted line, which is the net emission. Why is there a difference there? It's simply because at this time, you see at the bottom the green, the dark green line, we have natural CO2 sinks in the ocean and on land, which mop up some of the emissions that humans release in the atmosphere. So the goal is to reach net zero by the middle of the century. So gross emissions have to decline precipitously in a big manner and very fast. And that is obviously the challenge that many governments discussing at COP meetings are facing. And you see that once net zero will be reached, and even before that, there is a need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Because there will be residual emissions past net zero. I mean, there is no way we can bring everything to net zero emissions. For example, agriculture is going to release greenhouse gases forever. Also, heavy industries. So there is a need to increase the carbon removed, that's the light green color, in order to balance those residual emissions that cannot be cut to zero. So the IPCC says that to maintain the goal of 1.5 with limited or no overshoot requires to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in the order of 100 to 1,000 gigatons. That means billions tons of CO2 over the 21st century. That is a big challenge. And very importantly, it needs to be reminded to everyone that CDR is not a replacement for mitigation. It cannot solve the climate issue. Emissions need to decrease before even a CDR can make a dent. Of course, the more we wait, the more CDR needs to be implemented, making the challenge bigger every year. And the ocean is a blue frontier because everyone sees now that, you will hear that in the second panel, that CDR techniques on land are extremely challenging because of the space that is missing, that is in fact restricted, the competition with agriculture, competition for resources like water. So the ocean is more and more looked upon for doing that and to avoid those multiple feasibility issues on land. There is a huge potential in the ocean, and as Deputy Assistant Secretary said, the ocean is the largest reservoir of carbon on the planet. There is a huge surface area and volume, and that is important, the surface area, because removing CO2 from the atmosphere depends on the surface area that is available. The more surface area, the more you can absorb. And also the ocean has chemical characteristics that are very amenable to that, and that is used in ocean alkalinity enhancement. There is a need for monitoring and reporting because we want carbon dioxide removal to be honest, and we don't want to repeat in the ocean the mistakes which have been done on land with lots of suspicion about carbon credit being provided, some of them being potentially inexistent. There is a few scandals have been uncovered on land with regard to carbon credits. So it's very critical that we have in the ocean a very clear-cut and transparent process for monitoring, reporting, and verifying that the carbon credits that may be delivered are honest. To the point that the EU now is planning legislation to prohibit the mention of climate neutral businesses if it cannot be proven that, in fact, those businesses are carbon neutral. So what is MCDR? There is a range of techniques. We are not going to discuss all of them today, but if you start by the bottom left, the blue carbon ecosystems are a nice way to help mitigate. This is a nature-based option. Mangrove, salt marshes, seagrass beds store carbon in the sediment. In the soil, they are not magic bullets. They can maybe, the restoration of blue carbon ecosystem may be able to mop up maybe 1 or 2% of human anthropogenic CO2 emissions. That's very little, but they have many co-benefits. Then there is a technique called ocean iron fertilization experiments, microalgae cultivation. I don't know why they use cultivation here. Macroalgae may play a role also, mopping up carbon in the surface and then export carbon in the deep ocean. Artificial upwelling and downwelling are also investigated. Ocean alkalinity enhancement is one of them, delivering alkaline materials, either solids or liquid, in the ocean, deep sea storage, and also electrochemical ocean carbon dioxide removal. Today, we are going to focus on 2 of those approaches. The first panel will deal with restoring blue carbon, and the second panel, ocean alkalinity enhancement. The scientific community is very keen to help. We do not promote any approach, and we do not endorse any company, but we really want to promote research. Some of us are a little bit concerned about the fact that the private industry is moving forward in a big way with many knowledge gaps. I'm not talking about blue carbon, I'm talking about the other methods. So we produced a guide to best practices for ocean alkalinity enhancement research. And some of you, it's a very technical guide, so probably it will not be very useful to many of you, but if you want a copy, we have copies to be distributed. Thank you and enjoy the 2 panels.
All right, we are going to get right into it now with our first panel of the day. We're going to take a closer look, as Jean-Pierre said, at the role of blue carbon in climate mitigation and adaptation. Can I now invite up on stage, and I'll tell you a bit about them as they come up. First, Minna Epps, who's director of the Global Ocean Program at the IUCN. IUCN and its members were instrumental in getting blue carbon into the global policy arena and is currently running a global blue carbon accelerator fund. Come on up, Minna. Jana also is with us. Jana Friedrich. Jana is head of the radioecology section at the IAEA Marine Environment Laboratory in Monaco. Jana and her team specifically address the carbon sequestration capacity of blue carbon ecosystems, ocean acidification, marine microplastic pollution, and harmful algal blooms. Natalie Hilmy is with us as well. Dr. Hilmy is an expert in macroeconomics and international finance. In 2010, she joined the Scientific Center of Monaco as head of environmental economics. She's collaborated with IAEA's environment laboratories to find links between environmental sciences and economics to better evaluate the impacts and the costs of action versus inaction. We also have Phil with us, Phil Williamson. Phil has mostly worked for the UK Natural Environment Research Council. He's currently honorary associate professor at the University of East Anglia. Phil has led assessments of ocean-based carbon dioxide removal for the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission and the IPCC, among others. And finally, we have Michelle Kane. Michelle is the founder of Grogenics, which is headquartered here in Monaco. Now, Grogenics has developed a unique science-based ecological model that addresses the crisis of sargassum seaweed and landfills. So we're going to explain all that to you. in just a moment. So welcome, everyone. Please have a seat. All right, Minna, let me start with you. So Jean-Pierre did it a bit, but can you set the stage for us a bit more on blue carbon exactly, why it's so important to not just protect, but also restore our blue carbon ecosystems?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think indeed it was a very good scene setter for the two panels by Jean-Pierre Gatteau, but also the keynote really from the US State Department really framed also kind of the importance to invest in nature-based solutions. So yes, blue carbon. What is it? Well, we're talking about marine and coastal ecosystems and their ability to sequester carbon. And we've heard already that they are very efficient in doing so, and they store a lot in the soil. And there are three, and when I mentioned the three marine and coastal ecosystems, there are mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes, and marshes. And these are basically, when we say the three ones, are the three ones that are actually acknowledged by in the UNFCCC system. So which means that countries, as they put forward their naturally determined contributions, can include and account for these three marine and coastal ecosystem. And I would say that took quite a long time to get there. It was more like, I think, around 2019, really blue carbon really entered the international policy stage. So I think we recognize the importance of in the terms of their climate change adaptation and mitigation efforts, but they also provide a suite of other ecosystem services and benefits that are absolutely vital to coastal communities. So for example, even in terms of the resilience, they are, they can protect against erosions or storm. But the irony is that these nature-based solutions themselves are threatened by climate change. So that's also something that we're seeing now. And if you look at these these ecosystems, they basically occupy 0.2% of the globe, but yet they're really 10 times more efficient in terms of the sequestration in their soil. So very small fraction, and I think what we're talking about here when we set the scene is really, it cannot counteract other mitigation efforts. So number one, you need to cut emissions, right? You need to obviously restore. So under the global biodiversity framework, we also have, target 2. We often talk about target 3 to protect 30%. But target 2 is equally important, which is the restoration. But restoration is also very costly. So I know we have a range of panel here, but I'm happy to go more into the policy documents and also how to integrate the blue carbon into the different multilateral environmental agreements. But I want to hear from my fellows. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Minna. Natalie, well, let's talk about the economy of blue carbon. What kind of business potential is there in blue carbon offsets, and how would they work? Give us some examples.
We consider that blue carbon is the coastal blue carbon, but also the marine blue carbon is the open ocean and the deep sea. So for economic, we evaluate the carbon sequestration. And in fact, the science tell us how much is sequestered, and then we evaluate the price on the financial market. And for that, we consider that blue carbon, as Minna said, are not only only sequestering the carbon, but have many other benefits. So to understand how the offset market is working, first we have to look at the initiatives that are there to capture and sequester the carbon. Then we measure, so we listen to the science and the measurement that they do about the carbon sequestration. And then we need the verification and the certification. And this point is very important. We need independent bodies to do this. And then from where this part, we go to the credit issuance. And we know that 1 unit of carbon offset represents 1 ton of CO2 sequestered. And then we take this to the market, to the carbon market.
Thank you for that. Michelle, I'm just going to bring you in here. You run Grogenics, which is a startup on blue carbon offsets that's based on seaweed, but it's not putting things in. It's taking out sargassum, which is invasive seaweed. Tell us a bit more about that and how you measure the CO2 removal from the atmosphere.
Well, we are a bit ahead.
Can you take the mic, please?
Hello. We are a bit ahead of the process.
C'est bon? Can you hear? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Because we work into the protection of ecosystems. So basically, the invasion of sargassum into the ecosystems literally kills everything that is underneath, because it becomes a big mat that stops the sun from going through, and there is no more oxygen in the water. So we harvest the sargassum, both we call it near shore, which is just in the ecosystems, and when it reaches onshore. And we process it by various ways, mostly by making compost and by making, we use pyrolysis, that we make biochar, and then we include that in the compost. And we use the compost to build up, to assist farmers, local farmers normally, and we try to build up some agroforestry projects which are more sustainable to the action. So we take a different path of the protection way.
Right, but how do you measure the CO2 then removed from the atmosphere?
We follow a protocol. So we are being certified. We are in the process of certification through the gold standard sargassum protocol that just came out a couple of months ago, and we follow the protocol, which determines exactly the amount of CO2 that you sequester.
And is that a guarantee? Can that be guaranteed?
Yes, it can be guaranteed because they come and measure it and afterwards. So roughly 1 ton of the biomass that we avoid from the ocean is 1 ton of CO2 avoided. 1-to-1 ratio, more or less.
Phil, you co-wrote a paper with Jean-Pierre Gattuso on the limitations of blue carbon when it comes to climate change mitigation. Why, in your opinion, can we not rely on blue carbon habitats to offset carbon emissions?
Right, thanks very much.
In the mic.
Quite a few issues that we need to cover in being absolutely sure that it's going to have climate benefits. And for climate, then that operates on the global scale. So the first thing is scalability. Is whatever technique, coastal blue carbon or anything else, does it really sort of match up to the scale of the climate problem? I mean, it's great to have conservation, it's great to have seaweed removal from the natural production, but is it possible to really scale up to the gigaton level using the natural system? So that's the first issue. The second one is sort of the additionality of we're taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and if we're trying to sort of manage it and manipulate it, are we sure that that is the genuine climate benefit? Because plants photosynthesize fine, anything biological decays, releases that carbon dioxide at some point or another, or mostly it does. Now the coastal blue carbon is locked away in the sediment, but will it be locked away in the sediment for long enough, and can we be sure of that in the future? So that there's the permanence issue that we've really got to be sure of, and in order to put the carbon into an inaccessible form, are we inadvertently perhaps releasing other greenhouse gases like methane or nitrous oxide? Because it's anoxic, the organic carbon doesn't decay carbon plus oxygen equals carbon dioxide. Instead, it goes into different pathways and we might get extra methane. So that knocks off some of the benefit. And if you're also having it in coastal areas and you're looking there, then you might have calcium carbonate being produced, which sounds as though it's taking out extra carbon, but also that can release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And when you're measuring the carbon, the organic carbon in the blue carbon coastal areas, where's that carbon come from? Has it come from the atmosphere, or has it come from down the river? And is it already sort of dead carbon that's not going to decay, and that it doesn't matter where is the blue carbon system actually filtering it out and just storing it together? So all these things, and then when you add them all up, they can actually have quite a large effect of knocking down the value of that carbon. Apart from which, you've got to then have the governance, the mechanisms, and the scalability on the social side. Can enough communities around the world be persuaded that this is the right thing to do? So that those are the issues that I've been looking at and would like further discussion on.
we're going to talk a bit more about scalability in just a minute. But first, I want to bring Jana in. Jana, you and your team are specifically working on carbon sequestration capacity of blue carbon ecosystems. So what are the biggest challenges for you when it comes to measuring that precisely for blue carbon ecosystems?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So the previous colleagues already touched upon it. What you really need for calculating or for estimating carbon credits is a solid number of the amount of carbon that's locked away in the sediment or in the soil for a long period of time. And this consists of many other things. So it's not just the above ground biomass you see if you look at a mangrove forest, a seagrass meadow, or a salt marsh. It's not just the below ground biomass, which is the roots of these plants and all the animals. And it's not just the carbon that is the dead carbon that's in the soil, in the sediments. What you want to know is the carbon that's locked away for a long period of time. And the only way to have an estimate what stays there is using a time information. And this time information we can only get by using natural and artificial radioisotopes, because they decay in a certain amount of time, and this gives you the time information. So what we do is we take a sediment core, we measure the carbon, we measure the nitrogen, and then we slice this into thin layers and measure the age of these horizons. And with this information, we can calculate the amount of carbon that stays in the sediment. In addition, we need also to measure what is released from the sediment. If you imagine a compost in your garden, so this organic matter decays, and it also releases, if you have the smell, gases. It's methane, it's CO2, it's nitrous oxide, and these are more potent greenhouse gases than the CO2, and we need to subtract that. And then we get the solid number for calculating the carbon credits. It's not just you take one core, and then you extrapolate for one mangrove or for all mangroves. There's a really high variability. So for example, for estimating this carbon bur in the sediment between different seagrass ecosystems, it's a 600-fold variability. For seagrasses, for salt marshes, it's about 76, and the variability between different mangrove ecosystems is 19-fold. That means we need a lot of measurements of accumulation rates. So we as IAE, we cannot do it alone, so we need to partner, and we need to build capacity within our member states for them that have these blue carbon ecosystems to do it. But this is another story.
Just very briefly, again, so it's clear for everyone, you touched on this earlier, you work for the IAE. Again, how does the nuclear technique part work into that puzzle?
As I mentioned, we are using natural radioisotopes that occur in the environment and artificial isotopes that are brought into the environment by nuclear testing, like cesium. And they are in the environment, and since they're radioactive, they decay. And so, for example, you have, I give you a number 50, amount of 50 lead-210 or cesium. I don't go into detail with unit. For lead-210, it has a half-life of 22 years, roughly. After these 22 years, you have only 25 units of lead left. After another 22 years, divided 22 by 2. So this gives us a time information, and this is a nuclear and radioisotope method we are using. And we are not, it's IAEA, but we're not working related to energy, but we are using nuclear and isotopic tools.
Thank you for that clarification. Natalie, we've been talking about it already so far this afternoon. There has been a lot of debate on the efficacy of carbon offsets. So we saw that article that Jean-Pierre posted from The Guardian. The headline that struck me was 90% of rainforest carbon offsets are worthless. So how can the model work better? What's the secret when we're talking about the ocean space, and what can we learn from the lessons on land?
We can learn essentially 3 lessons. First, the leakage. meaning that REDD Plus projects face issues where protecting one forest area simply displaced deforestation to another area. Then we have impermanent storage, and this is what Phil was talking. If it doesn't stay in the sediment for blue carbon ecosystem, we cannot consider it long term, and it is not good. And then we have monitoring and verification, and this is a point for Vera, because it is a monitoring and certification institute, and this was a big problem. But I have the number. Blue carbon constituted only 0.15% of Vera's credit in 2022. So meaning maybe we can do better in blue carbon and then on land. And another thing is blue carbon is like a local solution for a global problem, because like Jana said, we should make the measurement locally to understand what is going on, how much is measured well, how much is really sequestered and stored, and then we can issue the credits.
Natalie, what's your view as an economist to what Phil was saying earlier? I mean, how does the business world feel when scientists say perhaps the carbon credit system isn't all that it's cracked up to be?
I think all carbon credits should be science evident and should be based on the science, and this is very important. So I'm listening very well to Phil, what he's saying, to Jean-Pierre's presentation as an economist, because without science we cannot issue the carbon credits. And this is what we always discuss with Michel as well. We really need monitoring, verification, and to have the numbers coming from the science. And I think this is also what he's doing. But then I think that blue carbon offsets offer a promising path towards a sustainable future. So for us, it can be promising if it is well done. Now we are talking about nature debt swap for developing countries. We are talking about different financing tools, and if they are well measured by the science, why not?
Mina, what's your reaction to what Phil was saying about these limitations?
No, I think, yeah, thank you. I'm enjoying this panel, and I think it's really interesting. Listen, and I think that kind of also demonstrates the challenges, and also maybe there is that reason what you were talking about, the science, in terms of why there is only 3 marine and coastal ecosystem, because there isn't the scientific guidance, etc., to assurance. But everybody wants to push the emerging blue carbon, and for the 3 existing one, there's still a lot of challenges. And there are many conservation organizations that doesn't even go near the blue carbon because it's too complex. But I think we have this discussion every time when there is the climate COP meeting, and it really is something that we have to tackle. We have to get it right because it has a lot of potential, but there are still a lot of uncertainty. And of course, for example, one of the things that we do, we run a blue carbon accelerator fund, trying to look at high quality blue carbon projects. And it's a challenge, and it's certainly, even if you set them up, it cannot be the only revenue stream, right? It has to be multiple revenue streams. So you cannot rely on, selling credit from the blue carbon alone to finance or the longevity of a project. But there are a lot of different principles that we could look into. And one of the importance, I think, to follow a lot of these principles is the fact that there's been a lot of concerns about a lot of intermediaries in the steps in the carbon market, but also the fact that it doesn't really always trickle down to the benefit of the local communities. So I think that's also another challenge, if we're now in the challenge, throwing things in the challenge bucket there. But I think that, for example, those principles that you follow for our project is really to make sure that there is that free prior consent for communities, that's established, but also the inclusivity and the participation of indigenous peoples and local communities, especially when it comes to marginalized groups, but also to ensure, feedback, accountability, and, grievance mechanisms. And I think also we are also collaborating with the Global Ocean Accounting Partnership, GOAP, And it's not just also for carbon, it's for the other benefits. How do you get those onto the balance sheet? So there are different systems. I think also there's not just one set of principles and guidelines that we follow. I mean, there are multiple ones. So I think the carbon project, I mean, the key is to be able to verify the carbon credits. Otherwise, it does not have a value. But probably I tend to be leaning more on the optimistic side that, you know, we can make that work.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that notion of blue carbon restoration efforts and blue carbon offsetting projects being more transparent and being more inclusive? Phil? Yeah, Michel?
Well, my own experience is that the methodology currently being approved are very, very sturdy, because we're going through it and there is a lot of criteria and they do a very good science behind it. So on my own experience, once you get through the process, you will have some good scientific support and some true numbers for your carbon sequestration. That's been my experience up to now.
If I can have a further comment on here, I think the needs from the economist side for any carbon offsetting, one's got to take account of the risks. Now, in any other field of life, we're aware of risk for insurance, but the risk for carbon being buried for climate significant periods, more than 100 years under blue carbon schemes. The problem is that if you have climate change, those ecosystems and those habitats are threatened. They won't survive temperatures rise of more than 1.5 or 2.5, depending on the habitat. So that if you're relying on them being built in, one can have wonderful look back in the past with the isotopes to say this is the accumulation rate that there has been over the last 10, 50, 100 years or so. This is the rate at which sediment's been coming down the rivers. This is the rate at which it's been building up. But what we're trying to do now with carbon offsets is projecting that into the future and saying this will continue for the next 50 or 100 years at the same rate that it's been doing at the past. And the world won't stay the same. We were going to have climate change. Those systems are inherently dynamic and unstable. They might have been around for a few hundred years under relatively stable climate conditions, but that is the big risk. Now, if you put the risk factor in and also emphasize that I'm referring to sort of for carbon dioxide removal, it has to be restoration, putting extra habitat in rather than just conserving the habitat that you've got. The cost of restoration, if you do it properly, is quite expensive. And the range of values of how much it costs to restore an area of mangroves, seagrass or salt marsh or whatever, it's several hundred, possibly thousands of dollars. You put in the risk factor as well, and then the question has to be asked, is this a cost-effective climate solution? Would our money for climate mitigation best be put in elsewhere, unless you take in all the biodiversity benefits and all the other benefits? Don't count the conservation, the restoration as being a climate benefit because you're not going to be sure that it will be. Count it as being a biodiversity benefit, count it as being conservation. The carbon offset mechanism is not well suited for this sort of habitat and this sort of system. Now, it might be for other situations, there might be ways that one can do it. But it's like a forest. What happens if your forest sets on fire? Right, you've lost all that carbon. What happens if your coastal ecosystem is washed away or is submerged under sea level rise? You've lost that carbon, or potentially.
Jana, let me bring you back in here, kind of off the back of what Phil was saying. So nations often who have a lot of blue carbon ecosystems, mangroves, for example, they're often less strong economically, right, in order to support expensive research that they might need. So what specifically is the IAEA doing to help member states so that these countries are not left behind and support them?
Yes, so what makes us really different or distinguishes us from classical research institute is that we have a mechanism at IAEA which is called technical cooperation. And in the technical cooperation, we are conveying the knowledge we are gaining and the capabilities to our member states. And in particular, to the in this case, to the countries that have the blue carbon ecosystems. As you mentioned, they are in warmer regions, so it's in large extent in Africa, in Latin America, and some of them are not as economically strong. So, and equipment, for example, to measure the carbon burial rate in sediment is quite expensive. A gamma spectrometer, round about 100,000 euros. alpha spectrometer, a little bit less. So not to speak about sampling equipment, or maybe drones for aerial photographs or remote sensing. So what we are doing, IAEA is purchasing equipment, but we also do the training on this equipment in the countries itself, or we are doing fellowships at IAEA. So as I said, we cannot do the measurements for the countries, but we can help enable them to do that. So, for example, we have regional cooperation programs with 16 countries in Latin America and in Africa ongoing, but also national programs in this framework which I just mentioned. In addition to that, to give you an example, last year we did a 2 weeks training workshop on ocean change and blue carbon. And we had participants from Argentina, Brazil, El Salvador, Malaysia, Mexico, Pakistan, Panama, Senegal, Tanzania, Thailand, but also UK and the USA, where we did in these 2 weeks from scratch how to set up a blue carbon project from the concept, from sampling to the measurement and into calculating carbon credits. So the whole thing. So this really helps the member states. And our aim is to train experts, for them to train the experts in the countries. Of course, we are aware that usually if in many countries you would give someone a training, or maybe in science the jobs are not well paid, they move to a different job, they are promoted, and then the training experience is lost. But still, we have to start somewhere. And this is how we are trying to enable our member states. But also, we are involved in the UN Global Decade Program for Blue Carbon, where we are addressing the SDGs 13 on climate action, 14 life below water, and 17 partnerships to achieve the goal. So we are also active in the outreach globally.
Thank you, Jana. Michel, talking about scaling up and the problem of scaling up, do you at Grogenics see your technique being scaled? And if so, how can it be scaled up enough to really make a difference?
We basically design our system to be modular. So we build up a module because of the distribution of the sargassum that can be anywhere. And we also use some carbon biomass to combine, so to avoid landfills at the same time, because to make a good compost, you need both. So we design a modular system that can be either replicated or increased in size and can be moved from one place to the other. So with this, we can very easily scale up our activity. And I would like to address also one of the questions about the risks and the permanence. There will always be a little bit of risk in the job that we're all doing. Mostly because, for instance, for us compost, we studied a lot the impact of compost and the permanence in the soil and all this, and it's a very, very complex story to evaluate. So the technology that is emerging, biochar, is proven that it will withstand hundreds of years, maybe thousands, and will stay sequestered the carbon into the biochar. So that's one solution, but there are also others. It's not because we cannot very precisely determine the benefits of adding carbon to the soil that it's not a good benefit. For instance, when you do I'll take an example. When you grow bamboo or grasses on land, you have some grasses that are very deep rooted. So when you cut them off, bamboo, for instance, can be used for construction. So you can grow bamboo, it grows very quickly, it's very efficient at transforming the biomass, but of course you will take out some carbon from the soil by doing this automatically. So but you can still sequester it into the building material. So these are different approaches. I think it's a combination of all those elements that can provide a solution.
Does anyone want to respond to what Michel said? Nina?
Yeah, no, I think, talking of risk, I think that's also where we always talk about, de-risking, etc. And again, it goes back to the same point that we actually have to make a concerted effort to get it right. So, for example, IUCN has been part of the Blue Carbon Initiative, which for the last more 10, 15 years, really been trying to bridge the science policy gap. So I think that you can work on different levels. So at the highest level, we really work on trying to integrate between the international policy framework. So looking for the Ramsar Convention, the CBD, the UNFCCC, but you always need to have your boots on the ground and ground truthing. And I think, yes, sometimes it is a bit of trial and error, but we have to apply the best standards. So I think it goes back to those key principles that we need to follow, whether it's safeguarding nature, empowering people, employing the best information and interventions that are out there, for carbon accounting for the projects, but also to operate locally and contextually. And I think the final point, really, as part of these kind of principles, is also to kind of mobilize high integrity capital to make sure. But there will be risk, but I think it's kind of managing that. We can't just always go for the safe. I mean, we have to be bold, visionary, and pragmatic. And I think investing in nature can never be a bad investment. It's just whether what you can actually bring and trade to the market. But I think that's the bottom line there. Thanks.
Phil, I just want to get back to your article talking about the limitations. Is it fair to say you're a blue carbon pessimist, or is that unfair?
I think I'm a blue carbon skeptic. I mean, that 30 years ago I started getting involved in ocean fertilization as a technique that would solve the climate problem. Now, ocean fertilization, it was on the screen earlier, is adding iron to the ocean. It seemed at the time, 30 years ago, it was straightforward and simple, and that hey, that would, you know, if we ever really got in trouble, that's all you need to do. And then the realization of the complexity of ocean fertilization has taken 30 years to work out. Now, we're in the same situation now. And apart from the seaweed that you're sort of collecting, there's an awful lot of schemes for growing seaweed in the ocean and dumping it down in the bottom of the sea and feeling, well, that can get rid of maybe a gigaton or so of carbon that way. But again, the scale of the process, if you're interfering, if you're changing things to that extent, you're going to have an awful lot of environmental impacts, and you're going to have an awful lot of other changes. Now, if you're restoring, then you get back to where you were. That's great. For the theoretical potential of these ideas is always about 10 times greater than what is actually achievable. And for blue carbon, great, we restore as much as we possibly can, but that might only be about 5 or 10% of what we've lost.
Right.
And so that therefore that brings down, and if at the end of the day we're talking about a climate benefit equivalent to 0.1% of our emissions, then it's only a very small, and any climate benefit is a benefit. But if we're here talking about the climate problem and countries' nationally determined contributions to solving the climate problem, then I'd say that the blue carbon, coastal blue carbon, is great but don't count it in your carbon budget. Just do it.
Okay, so what else can we do then besides reducing CO2?
And there are other ways of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but some of them, the ones that work, are expensive, the chemical methods, and the other ones use up a lot of land, and land is in short supply. So there isn't, and the graphs that Jean-Pierre showed of having a large residual emissions and a large amount of carbon dioxide, I think that those have done us a disfavor in the last 10 years through IPCC, because theoretical modelers, you can put in negative emissions. And it was assumed 10 or 15 years ago that one could do negative emissions at that scale. And that got into the climate models, it accepted politically, and now we're realizing how hard it is to do negative emissions. And the implications of that haven't really sunk through, because we've almost left it too late. Because it's the next 5 or 10 or 15 years, the policies then will determine whether or not we're going to survive, basically, in a not that we're going to go extinct, but that the future is going to be determined by the next 10 years, and we're not going to get the scale of carbon dioxide removal going on that timescale. Therefore, we've got to get really serious about emission cuts.
All right, we're going to open it up to your questions. Who would like to start? Go on, don't be shy. Anyone? Oh, here's one right here. But yeah, here we go. Right, there we go.
It's dangerous for a future panelist to ask a question of the current panel.
but I'm curious, because so you're going to be on the OAU panel coming up afterwards, so go ahead, have at it.
But it's a quick question. I mean, the scale of blue carbon, a lot of it depends, as I understand it, on restoring ecosystems or changing ecosystems, not only in northern countries, but also in southern countries. And I may be wrong on that, but if that is the case, I'm just wondering what the ethical issues are associated with using land or parts of the ocean connected to land for solving a problem that really has been caused by northern countries. How does that factor into the thinking process on specifically on blue carbon?
Who'd like to speak, Mina?
No, but I can let others, but I think I did touch upon that a little bit in terms of the kind of social ethical issues that you need to have your free prior consent. You have to do it inclusive matter, but I think that's a key point. So I think that's kind of connected to one of your points.
Natalie?
Yes, I can maybe add, if you take a part of the coast to have resorts, is it better than mangroves? I don't think so. And who is going to benefit from those resorts? The northern countries, because they have money, they go there as a tourist, and the country who is there receiving those tourists, okay, they will receive the revenue, but then they will lose the nature because we destroy the nature to construct our resorts. And when we consider blue carbon, we tell them that you can keep your nature, you can keep your biodiversity, and it will bring you more money than tourism. And especially in the case when we have COVID, for example, people are not traveling anymore. So meaning that we have a solution that is long-term, that is still here, even if the tourists are not coming.
Michel, how do you work with local communities in your business?
Well, that's exactly it. What we do is that we use the blue carbon side of the ocean, and we make products with it that can be useful to all those communities. So we help the fishermen because they get involved in cleaning the area where they go fishing. We help the farmers as local as possible by providing them, often these smallholder farmers, it's called, they often don't have access to any type of fertilizer. So we did a project in the Dominican Republic, for instance, where we tried with 15 small growers, just bring them the compost that we made. And it made a world of a difference to them because now they had increased yield on everything that they were producing. And they produced that for their families and all this, so it's very decentralized, the approach. So I think part of the solution is to make products that will be useful to the local community.
Another question? Who's got the mic? Yeah, here.
Hello?
Hi. We can see you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. There's two other big factors. One was mentioned, which was biodiversity or ecosystem services. And I'm wondering if any of the organizations are pricing that in, because that's got to go alongside the value of the blue carbon side, and it's got to have a lot of value, right? So I don't know if people are measuring it. I don't know if any of organizations or sister organizations, but that's got to be an important component. And then there's a third thing that wasn't mentioned, which is blue carbon, whether they're mangroves or salt marshes, protect against storm surges. And we're already seeing massive increases in claims on insurance. So that ought to be factored in too. And I think when you start to add up all these things, while that initial thing may not be very economic, by adding those things on, it might push some of these projects over a hurdle line where they become a lot more valuable. So is that all coming into the mix, and are organizations working on that?
Natalie?
Yes, we are talking about carbon sequestration, but of course there are other ecosystem services. Mina has already mentioned them. We are talking about carbon credits, but now we have the biodiversity credit as well. We have the plastic credits. We have a lot of new instruments coming on the market. I'm a bit worried when I see all those coming on, for example, the voluntary carbon offset market is not stable, is still volatile, and the price of carbon is not right. We have several carbon markets. We don't have one carbon market. So meaning that if we are in Europe, the price of carbon will be $100 per ton. I know now it dropped because I have the price of carbon on March, it was $56, but it's going up again, and this is for sure. But if we look at the price of carbon in developing countries, in Africa, for example, it can be $5, and it's and this is not normal. I have a problem. We were talking about ethical issues. It is a kind of neo-colonialism. If we tell the developing country, you keep your nature, and we continue to pollute, to develop, and you take care of the nature to offset our carbon, this is an issue.
Mina?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. But I think that also, I don't think it's just that the natural warming comment will happen in the global south, right? I think we have a lot to do here in the north. And you're saying, oh, but the land is so valuable. But we see a lot of new innovation as well. I mean, the greening of roofs, etc. Like how do you can build it into the urban environment? So I still think there's a lot of scope there. And of course, we did mention that kind of storm surge. And then there's a lot of economic estimates and how many millions and billions that actually is worth in terms of prevention. So I think that's definitely been factored in. But as you said, we are now talking about the carbon aspect of it. What we also do with our project, we have, for example, Eisen developed a global standard for nature-based solutions. And they're not nature-based solutions for climate change. They're nature-based solutions for tackling biodiversity, social safeguards. So it's basically to tackle both environmental and societal challenges. But one thing, and then one of these 8 criteria is to look at the economic viability of the project. And then the other thing, one of the other criteria is to balance trade-offs. And I think that's also something that we often forget because we zoom into one problem that we're fixing. And whatever we want to do to protect climate change will have an impact, local impact on biodiversity. So I think that it's really, again, comes back to having a much more system thinking in how we project and do things and not just dealing with the problems in silos. So having that integrated problem solution, I think it's also key. Thanks.
Thank you for your question. Anybody else? Yep.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for your talks. Before I will ask my question, I will begin with a little hope. In Nice, so it's a 340,000 people town, we have actually three grass species, so it's a big hope. I am in charge of MPA creation in Nice, and my question for you would be, what would be your advice to better protect and also to help the seagrass that we found next to the airport, Zooster. We all know Posidonia and Cimodocea, but we have also find this little patch of seagrass. And what would be your advice inside the future MPA? And we don't have time to wait that the MPA will be created with status. How can I get involved economical stakeholders to help me to develop this little patch of seagrass next to the airport?
Any ideas? Michelle, Phil? Yeah? Who'd like to go ahead, Natalie?
Oh. I will go to economics. We can evaluate them. If we show that they have a high value, maybe people will protect them because they have a high value.
So go to an economist and get a report.
Yes, but how to do it?
Call
I'm
one
not
up.
an economical person, and I don't know.
Need the
we
science.
have a scientific committee,
Yes.
and how can we find the way, the method to evaluate this little patch of seagrass that don't have really an economical value because it's too small for now?
Yes, but maybe we need the science to tell us if it captures the carbon, for example. If it is, we can give them a value thanks to the financial market. We know the price of carbon, so it's not difficult to do it. And then maybe you can issue carbon credits
So with
or
this
blue bonds.
with the size of the seagrass patch, where we can evaluate, thanks to the scientific studies, already the value of blue carbon that is can be stored in, right?
You have it.
Yeah, we can go further and make more studies to see the size, and then with the publication we can already evaluate.
Let's let Jana weigh in.
Yes, I have a really hands-on proposal to add the aspect of the valuation of the carbon captured in sediment. So my colleague Beat, who is doing work on blue carbon sequestration estimation, is here. Beat, let's go there. Let's take a sediment core. Yeah. Let's measure the carbon.
All right.
Let's date the core, and then we know what's there.
Okay.
How does it sound?
But there's a fundamental flaw if by accepting that that has value and you have a carbon credit, that allows someone to carry on producing carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases. That actually makes the problem worse. It doesn't solve the climate problem. I think that the value of your environment ought to be sacrosanct, and that apart from the fact that all countries want economic development. They all want to have higher GDPs every year. That for IPCC meetings that we went to Fiji, and there was a lovely marina there. But 5 years earlier, there was mangroves there. They've got a lovely airport there. 5 years earlier, it was mangroves. So every country wants to have its economic development. And every country wants to have its airport. Apart from Monaco doesn't have an airport yet, but I understand they're working on it.
Mina's dying to jump in.
No, dying. Blue-green infrastructure, that's also important. No, but I don't think, restoring or protecting or getting carbon for a small patch of our seaweed is going to trigger, be an incentive to emit more carbon. But definitely the point is that we have to stop emitting. I think, listening to you, I think there's a wider issue to be addressed. I mean, that was one example, and that is really exactly that. How do I access information? Where do I go, etc. And I think that we really see a big opportunity, but also a gap in terms of the technical assistance and development. So we often see, even if the projects are taking place in the global south, a lot of people are, is fly-in expert, etc. How do you build that expertise locally? It doesn't matter if it's in the Mediterranean or Western Indian Ocean. So I think there's still that. So we have that component also attached. And I see my colleague Melissa was in the back. I don't know if she, but yeah, she's sitting down now. Is actually running also the Blue Carbon Accelerator Fund and the Blue Natural Capital Funding Facility. And with that, we have attached capacity building and technical assistance for developers. So we can actually build that cohort of just entrepreneurs, but also how to apply the best technology and to make sure there's some standardization of application of methodologies.
Thank you, Mina. I think we have time just for one last question, and then we'll do a wrap up. Do you hear?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. So I am also a panelist in the second session. So,
the conflict's starting. The clashes are starting.
I guess yes. So thanks first for a very interesting session, and I was very heartened to hear, even in the introductions and by several of you, the importance of prioritizing steep emission cuts. And at the same time, there's a lot of talk about blue carbon offsets. So, I mean, how do we go beyond saying that emission cuts are needed, like this mantra that can remain empty if, in fact, the offsets that we're creating from blue carbon are being bought by oil and gas companies? So I guess my question is, you as contributing in this process of developing high quality, high integrity blue carbon credits, how do you see your role as ensuring that integrity? And hence, also, have you been analyzing like who exactly is buying these credits, and how can we ensure that the buyers are actually reducing their emissions before recurring to CER?
Yeah. The ethical issue is a key one. Mina?
Yeah, okay, I'm happy to start. And I think actually that was going to be my question to the next panel. So like, how can you ensure that? No, but I think that, the mantra we do, it's always there, cut emission. I don't think investing in nature and restoring it actually gives a green light or green card to continue mission. Of course, it is concerning when you are, flying all over the world for different conferences, and then you can tick a box to do your offset and you can sleep well at night. I mean, I think that and just to say that IUCN's core business is really, it is conservation of nature. And that's why we don't solely trade in, that's why we are looking into the nature credits, biodiversity credit. But it's really about, it's one part of the puzzle, and that's why we apply the nature-based solutions. And if you can get revenue and it's measurable and verifiable, and to your point, can actually ensure equitable and benefit sharing of the revenue, because that's also sometimes is not proven. Let's go for the best practice, and by no means do I feel like we are contributing by restoring nature to giving a green light to everything. But it's a good point. Thanks.
Natalie?
Oh, yeah. The idea is not to offset and continue to pollute. The idea is to reduce the CO2 emission, and some of them we cannot reduce enough. It is residual. And then we are looking for the solutions. And nature-based solutions are there. Nature has always been here to look after us. So now if we look after the nature, maybe the nature is going to help us to mitigate our climate, or at least to give us other ecosystem services, because it's not only about mitigation. And I think what is still missing maybe is a regulatory framework to see that we are doing the sustainable practices.
Good point. We just have a few minutes left. Can I ask you all to just give me a one-sentence takeaway, something you want everyone here to go home with from this particular panel right now? Michel?
Well, I would say that there are solutions, and we all need to get together in order. We on our side, we work very hard on the science of it and developing the systems that are adapted and cost-effective to the. It's actually a disaster what's happening with the amount of sargassum that comes up is increasing every year, and it won't go back before. Either you cool down the ocean or you stop the diversal of agriculture, fertilizer into the oceans. So we need to combine all the various solutions towards making it work. And I think it will be a combination of all sorts of different perspectives. So we are trying to do a little bit towards that with a solution that is scalable and that we think that can have an impact on the long term.
Thank you, Michel. Phil?
I think that we have developed a sort of an increased awareness of how the issue of scalability, and that the blue carbon solution on the coastal side is a teensy-weensy little bit as a solution of the climate problem. It can have lots of other benefits, but for the climate, it's not going to solve the problem.
That's noted. Natalie?
I think we need a paradigm shift. We need to have a nature-positive economy. We have extracted a lot from the nature, and now we need a regenerative economy.
Jana?
In order to get funding to protect blue carbon ecosystems, we need to sell the multiple benefits, not just the climate benefit. It's coastal protection, biodiversity, promotion of fish stocks altogether. This is what you need to sell. And in order to do reliable carbon credit estimates, we need really solid numbers of the sequestration rates in the ecosystems.
Thank you. Minna?
Well, I think the price of carbon is one thing that's really been highlighted here, and we've heard it throughout the last few days. I think I would just say a kind of a thought, and maybe a segue over to the next panel, would be that I think that, as we said, investing in nature is safe in the way that, multiple benefits. I think when you go to the geoengineer solutions, it's much more narrow. It doesn't have the same multiple revenue stream, benefits for environment society, different way of looking at it. But I think also it's the scalability that what we're talking about here. Of course, there will be some kind of threshold capacity with nature, but I think you kind of alluded to very much in the beginning, Natalie, which was the potential also of open and deep sea nature-based solutions. So I think the key message would be, all hands on deck. We have to continue to really invest in nature, do that, but at the same time get the carbon pricing and the carbon market right. but at the same time, we also need to look at potential emerging blue ecosystems as well in parallel. So, thanks.
Thank you so much, Mina. Thank you so much to all of our panel. Let's give them a round of applause. All right, we're going to take now a quick coffee break. Let's meet back here in 25 minutes at 4:25 for our next panel on ocean alkalinity enhancement. Thank you. Merci. Thank you. That was very good. Thank you. No, so it was easy. You were all very interesting. Thank you. That's on. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please come back into the room? We're going to get our next session underway in just a minute. All right, welcome back, everyone. We are going to jump right into our next panel now. If everyone could come and take a seat, we'll get started. Our next panel on the hot button subject of ocean alkalinity enhancement. Can it work? And if so, what are the consequences? Would you please welcome my panelists for this session? I'll tell you a bit about them as they come up on stage. Daniela Basso. Daniela is from the University Milano Bicocca. Daniela is a professor there. She is interested in marine calcifiers, and she's leading an international project that is funded by Oasis that's aimed at exploring the response of marine biota to ocean liming, which is one of the proposed techniques of OAE that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes. Also with us, Nicolas Dez. Nicolas is a sailor, an engineer, an MBA. He's also very young, as you can see. After first creating a clean tech startup for the shipping industry, he is now focused on ecosystem restoration and carbon removal through his new company, Pronue. We have Rob Steenkamp with us. Rob is a practicing lawyer and a legal researcher at the University of Hamburg and at Geomar in Kiel. His work is focused on the law of the sea, international environmental law, and the peaceful settlement of interstate disputes. Then we have Doug Wallace. Doug is with Dalhousie University. His research focuses on quantifying the ocean's uptake of CO2 from the atmosphere, and most recently involves participation in field trials of ocean alkalinity enhancement in a small fjord near Halifax. And finally, we have Alexandra Deprez from IDRI. Alexandra works on international climate governance and cooperation. She's also the lead author on a recently published article in Science magazine that was titled Sustainability Limits Needed for CO2 Removal. So welcome to all of you. Thanks so much for being here for this panel on OAE. Alexandra, I'm going to start with you. Just explain to everyone, if you will, in general terms, what carbon dioxide removal is, whether it's land-based or ocean-based. So tell us about that.
Yes, and this question, responding to this, was made easier by Jean-Pierre, who already gave us some basis of what is CDR. But yes, so CDR basically are methods to sequester and store durably atmospheric or ocean-based carbon dioxide. So they can be nature-based, as what we discussed earlier, and on land, that can be like reforestation, and they can be technology-based, mostly at early stages of feasibility, such as what we will discuss now, and also, for instance, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. But more than that, I guess, what I think is more interesting is what is the role of CDR within the bigger picture of climate change. And as was discussed earlier, I mean, the IPCC is extremely clear that if we want to have any chance of keeping the 1.5 limit, the key element is steep emission cuts in this decade. And so that means minus 43% GHG emissions by 2030. At the moment, current country plans project to increase emissions by 3%. Yes, and that means we need to be phasing out fossil fuels. This is key context whenever we talk about CDR, which brings me to my last point. And I take the liberty really of being a bit provocative. In following CDR, both in the science and also in the policy arenas, I would say that CDR at the moment, the way it's being framed, is really a distraction. In the sense that we currently have a bathtub full of emissions, and the tap of emissions is continuing to flow. And so if we are just removing a little bit of CDR, that's not going to make it. And the problem is that we cannot scale sufficiently CDR to make a difference in the short term. So again, I think it really poses the question of, in this community, who is funding CDR? Why are we seeing such a big enthusiasm around CDR at the moment by oil and gas companies? At the same time that there is a lack of political willingness to put in place the actual solutions, such as renewable energy, phasing out fossil fuels. So I think this, to me, is really an important context whenever we talk about CDR. And I also think that this kind of session, as we are here today is essential, because injecting realism and integrity in the discussion on CDR is essential. So I'm really delighted to be here. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us and for being so frank. Doug, so you have been conducting field trials of ocean alkalinity enhancement, or OAE, near Halifax in a small fjord. Just explain to everyone who hasn't quite got their mind around it yet what exactly OAE is.
Okay, so OAE, ocean alkalinity enhancement, it is a form of marine carbon dioxide removal. And as its name suggests, it involves deliberately adding alkaline substances, we can get into what they are later, to seawater to increase the ocean's ability to take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And in a way, that's the idea, is that it's an enhancement of the, I would say, natural way in which the ocean has taken up CO2, especially fossil fuel, derived CO2 from the atmosphere over the past 250 years, making the ocean almost the biggest sink for fossil fuel CO2, the biggest sink, of course, being the atmosphere, which is the problem we're trying to solve. So the excess, or the process, it's an abiotic process, it's a chemical process. I tend to think of chemistry myself as a marine chemist as being quite natural, you know, even though it doesn't necessarily involve directly life. But we're pumping, the reason behind it, or the rationale behind it, we're pumping CO2 into the atmosphere at the moment. It's dissolving in surface seawater, reacting with water, but also, importantly, reacting with naturally occurring alkaline substances in seawater, which makes the ocean so effective as a sink. So OAE is, the idea behind it is to enhance that capacity, should take up more CO2, and at the same time, in contrary to the uncontrolled way we're manipulating seawater chemistry right now, it should also potentially partially address the issue of ocean acidification.
So, Doug, it sounds good in theory. Just keep the mic for a sec. I guess the question is it really feasible in practice, which is what you and your team are trying to figure out, correct?
Well, I mean, yes, the issue is scalability, and there are these ethical issues as well, for sure. Yes, it is. We're presently at Dalhousie working on a project in partnership with a Canadian startup that is conducting a pilot study adding magnesium hydroxide to the waters of Bedford Basin. It's a little fjord right in Halifax, in full view of the public, literally, because sometimes we've, not by the alkalinity, but by adding dye at the same time, we've turned the waters of the Bedford Basin bright pink, which has been noticed. And so we're doing that at Dalhousie in partnership. The company, Planetary Technologies, is adding up to 20 tons of magnesium hydroxide a day to the waters of this small fjord. And we, in parallel, are taking advantage of that pilot study to look at whether we can measure it, how we can measure it, whether it's taking up CO2 from the atmosphere, how we can model it, and also conducting some research into impacts.
Okay. So, Daniela, you are also studying the feasibility of OAE and its potential impacts on marine life. And just hearing about it, and again, I don't know a lot about it, but it does sound like we're disturbing natural systems to some extent when we're doing that. So, first of all, is that what it is? And second of all, how do we know that OAE will be safe for marine ecosystems and other organisms?
Yes, the question is very complex, and actually the short answer is we are studying and making research in order to have the answer, to avoid to make any kind of significant harm. That is one of the bases of our research. The better answer is a little bit longer. So let's start from 1957, when someone said that human beings are now carrying out a large-scale geophysical experiment of a kind that could not have happened in the past, nor be reproduced in the future, because they were realizing, Revel and Seuss were realizing that we were using fossil fuels at a rate that was impossible to imagine before, and after the use of the fossil fuel that is not a renewable source, nobody will do it again, right? So the point is that we did already a lot on our environment. We see the effects of this change that was not desired, but we already geoengineered the planet somehow, and we had no idea what we were doing. At least most of us had no idea. And someone is denying even now. That is even worse. Now we are facing the fact that we have a narrow window, as probably Jean-Pierre said before, to avoid the worst. So to avoid that complete disaster for us, first of all, because the planet will always react somehow, but probably without us, you know? So this is on a historical scale. And so this narrow window means that within 2030, we should reduce of about, the order of magnitude is 10 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So it's, as she said, more than 40% of what we are emitting. So it's a huge amount. And we are not put it in context. We are not doing actually something to reduce the emission. That is the first duty that we have. We are not doing something that is on the scale of this desired result in 2030. That's why we are called to make something. Doing nothing is not a good choice. This is the consideration. And so that's why I'm here. I mean, so that's why we are trying to find a way to solve the problem with different techniques. And I've had the opportunity to lead this project funded by the OASIS program that is aimed at testing the ocean alkalinity enhancement at the level of the mesocosm. What are they? Just in few words. When you test something in the scientific context, you can test the effect at the level of a single organism, so a single animal or a single plant, or you can test it on the scale of a community or at the scale of the natural environment. This is very different, and you cannot approach the natural environment before having any kind of idea of what happens to the single, right? The single organism, the single creatures. And we are at the mesocosm level. Mesocosm level means that we were working on these enclosures that are filled with natural water, with everything inside. So we just filled with natural water that is full of plankton and larvae and whatever. And we did it in two places. We did it in Crete, which is in the eastern Mediterranean, and we did in Vigo, that is in Spain, on the Atlantic coast. Why? Why this choice to do both? Because they have very different quality of the seawater. So the salinity is important, the kind of saturation of the water in terms of carbonates that are inside, naturally inside, is very important in order to understand the response to alkalinization. And so we did it. We did this experiment with replicates. Okay, it's a scientific jargon. I don't want to go into details.
But what did you find out?
Yeah. So, but we find out that it's feasible. I mean, and we found out another thing that is very, very important to test it with different seawater. So the quality, the type of the water in which you are trying to do this is really very, very important in controlling the answer, the response. Because supersaturation can lead to secondary precipitation of minerals, so it can reduce the efficacy of the efficiency of the process, can result in problems to the plankton, to the benthic. So we don't want some kind of precipitation that can occur. And of course, depending on the natural quality of the seawater, this can occur or not. And the other result that we had, very briefly, I think that we have really to work a lot. So the first answer is we need more research in other places, for sure. The second answer is we need technical advancement in order to do it in the best possible way. I think that there is a lot of space for improvement on that.
All right, we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So we know it's feasible. I guess the next question for you, Rob, is what about from a legal standpoint, from a governance standpoint? Talk to us about those aspects of OAE if it were to be implemented on a large scale.
So I think your mention of large scale is maybe sort of two caveats from the legal side of things. The first one is that we need to listening to what Daniela said now, we need to differentiate between research on the one hand and sort of full-scale commercial deployment on the other, because scalability over there makes a big difference. But as we start realizing what needs to happen to test things in the natural system, sometimes the line between deployment, commercial deployment and research can be a little bit blurry. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that regulation, at least at the international level, very different for commercial operation versus research. And the other thing that goes a little bit to what was said on the previous panel is there is at this stage no law, international or domestic, that specifically regulates OAE. That doesn't exist. And as an activity that involves these multiple actors, we have private actors, we have public actors, we have all these different actors in an activity that could potentially have transboundary impacts. From a legal point of view, it means that we need to then look at what do we have if there is no actual law. And in that context, we then would differentiate between national law and international law. And at the national law side, countries will enact legislation depending on what their own needs are. And this, despite what their own needs are, still has to account for international obligations that they have signed up for. So this could be things like, if, for example, if you think of the Convention on Biological Diversity, if we think of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, there's a specific part in that international treaty that deals with the protection and preservation of the marine environment. And in the context of OAE and international law that's gaining quite a lot of interest is the London Dumping Protocol. Now, very briefly, the London Dumping Protocol controls the dumping of material into the ocean, which could be alkaline substances in the case of OAE, and the prevention of this pollution from having adverse effects on the marine environment. And why the London Protocol is attracting so much attention is that it has in 2013, they adopted this amendment that will effectively allow for some framework to regulate what they refer to as legitimate scientific research. So a real science-focused aspect of it. And they have this assessment framework that you could try and evaluate certain experiments against. The difficulty there is that this amendment is not yet in force. So not enough countries have yet ratified it for it to actually be applicable. Despite this, though, the parties to this convention, this treaty, are constantly trying to actually add OAE as one of their regulated activities. So that's an interesting development to keep a lookout on. On the flip side, if we look at some of the commercial aspects, I'm excited to hear later on this afternoon, we'll talk about marine CDR in the context of the climate negotiations. If we think of the Article 6 mechanism at the Paris Agreement, this could be quite interesting if we then have science on the one side trying to restrict commercial operation, but on the other side, an Article 6 mechanism that actually allows for carbon credits to be traded, that actually envisages a place for MCDR. This could be quite an interesting juxtaposition to keep in mind. So, in a nutshell, I think from a regulatory point of view, it's quite fragmented. There's a lot of things happening, but we're not operating in a legal black hole, so to speak. There is legislation available. It's just about how we're going to effectively utilize it. And I think regulatory dialogue is going to become increasingly important. We have a lot of institutions doing different things about similar aspects, and I think it's becoming increasingly important for these institutions to start cooperating and trying to unify some of their work. Yeah.
Okay, so it's not a legal black hole, but it sounds a little bit like the Wild West, possibly.
I would definitely not say the Wild West. There are certainly a lot of international obligations that states have to conform to, and by and large, a lot of the states where this research is starting to take place do have national legislation to control pollution. Okay. So it exists, it's just that it's not very specific and it is developing.
Okay, so Nicolas, that's a perfect opportunity to bring you in as a business person. Tell us a bit more about your business model, how it works.
Yes, sure. So I think there's a variety of view on this panel, and it's quite interesting. Maybe some very basic thing about OAE is actually there are many ways of doing OAE. We are talking different feedstocks, we are talking different processes, we are talking different means of dispersion of that alkalinity, different alkalinity types, different alkalinity forms. Is it solid? Is it liquid? In different places. Is it on the seabed? Is it offshore? In surface waters, etc. And of course, these very various ways of performing ocean alkalinity enhancement come with various practicalities, economics, concerns or aspects around regulations. What we do specifically is, and maybe just to give an example here, it's very different from the for the non-expert. Maybe it's very different to put olivine on a beach than to put quicklime on a ship to be dispersed out on the sea, or to be leveraging the brines of a desalination plant. So in what regards Prono and what we are trying to build, essentially what we do is we develop and deploy small automated water treatment systems that plug in downstream of existing coastal facilities that have an effluent or liquid discharge to the sea. The idea being to make it less alkaline, less acidic or more alkaline, with two expected outcomes as brought earlier in terms of local mitigation of acidification and restoration of what essentially is a natural capture and storage capacity of its surrounding waters. So more specifically, what we do is we bring dissolved carbonate alkalinity. Why we picked that specific one is because there are decades of experience in using that specific alkalinity in the context of shellfish farming or aquariums. And from a business perspective, since it's the question, of course, these businesses could not exist even 3 years from now, because they essentially rely on what's called CO2 removal certificates. Now, these ones are sold today on what's called the voluntary carbon market. They are not regulated yet. However, there are different instruments from traditional carbon credits, and they are becoming regulated at a fast pace, namely in Europe, where they are integrating the fact that we need net zero, we need carbon removal to achieve our net zero targets.
Thank you. Alexandra, something Daniela touched on before and Olivia touched on this morning, you know, we call this geoengineering. It's a little bit playing with the planet, some people would say. I mean, what are your thoughts about that? And do you think we really need CDR? Is it something that's mandatory? I mean, shouldn't we just be limiting our CO2 emissions and that's it? Or do we need it?
In terms of geoengineering, yes, so CDR is geoengineering. My understanding is that this term is not being used by the IPCC anymore and the community, in part also because of the optics. Geoengineering sounds scary. And perhaps by throwing out that term, we've also thrown out the baby in the bathtub, meaning the precautionary approach that such a scary term could induce. And so I think, yes, I think the question of do we need CDR? Yes, I mean, the IPCC is clear that we need CDR, some amount of CDR to get to net zero and hence to keep temperature at a safe level. But I think the whole question is really right-sizing the role of CDR within the bigger picture. And I think that's what we tried to do in part in the paper that we published in Science, with two of the co-authors are here today, so Phil Williamson and Jean-Pierre Gattuso. And so what we did was really evaluate what are the sustainability risk levels and sustainable levels of deployment of land-based CDR. And from that, we drew a set of recommendations both for all types of CDR and for the science and policy community. And so with the idea of really injecting realism and integrity in this discussion. And I'll just list them very quickly. Basically, the first thing that we think is essential is really understanding what is the sustainable carbon dioxide removal budget. So really understanding for all types of CDR, what are the sustainability risks and what is hence the actual projected sustainable deployment that we could have. Because at the moment, the IPCC doesn't really integrate that that element of environmental feasibility and hence provides technical mitigation potential that is very high and hence can, I think, can have the risk of misinducing governments and society at large in thinking that we can depend on CDR as a future solution, as a way to, in a sense, clean up the mess that we're doing now by choosing not to reduce emissions steeply. And I think that's where the second thing comes in, which is really about the models of the IPCC need to be much more, also ensure that the amount of CDR that is integrated there is not over projected. And again, finally, the question of what this implies in terms of the narrative we have around CDR and the governance that is emerging. And I think for that, it's essential to really start off with the sustainability limits and the feasibility constraints of all of this. And that would lead us really to think of CDR as a way, as a sort of rare resource that we need to hence allocate to the most priority uses and not to offset continued or ongoing fossil fuel emissions. Thanks.
Does anybody want to react to that before we move on? Nicolas? No? Yeah.
I think that those words, realism and integrity, they're really very important words, and ones I think many of us working in the field it's unusual for us in the scientific world to have to deal, you're meant to be honest in science, but we don't really have to think about these large political, ethical issues until now. Mm-hmm. So this is all very new to many of us, and we're really struggling with these concepts. But realism, both realism about the size of the sinks and the scalability, but realism about the way the political world works, these are very important considerations. And I would admit, me speaking as a scientist, I'm sometimes a wee bit naive about the political world.
Doug, just a quick question. Oh, wait, no, someone wanted to speak to that point? Okay, I'll come to you in just a minute, Daniela. But Doug, just a quick question on the mitigation benefits. We're looking at life cycle considerations as well. Just a quick word on that.
Yes, I mean, that's a massive challenge. There's what happens in the ocean sort of side of things, which some of us are working on, but how you get the alkaline substances, where they come from, and that issue, and what is the carbon cost of that, and what are the other environmental costs of that, and the financial cost of that. These are all massive, massive questions. Right now, however, there was a recent analysis, it just came out last month, by a kind of a think tank in British Columbia. It's a techno-economic study of all CDR methods. It's pretty, when I read it, I thought it was pretty well done. And the sense I got from it was urgency. I mean, this is something we really need to think about now. It's almost too late. And then they came down firmly at the end, comparing all CDR methods on land and in the ocean, that really OAE is the only one that is potentially scalable to the 10 gigatons of carbon per year number that is talked about, or CO2 per year that's talked about. But that there is a tremendous amount of innovation and thinking and planning that has to go into that we're not even close to it, but of all the options, their conclusion was it's the only one that comes close to that number, potentially.
That's interesting. Danielle, I want to get your thoughts on that as well, the realistic potential of OAE, and particularly the expense, because we're talking about a lot of rocks or whatever being put into the ocean.
Yeah, I was just adding a few words from the technical point of view. What I was trying to simulate in my experiment was ocean liming. Ocean liming is one of the possible techniques that has been thought that consists in spreading this alkaline material, reacting alkaline material from ships. So they were thinking of using the normal maritime traffic as a vector to spread a huge amount, huge amount in the sense very spread out in any oceans of the planet, of this material to react in the seawater and to have an increase in alkalinity. This is the basic rough idea, okay? But to do that, so we have to know where does it come from, this alkaline material. So it has been mentioned magnesium hydroxide. We are using calcium hydroxide, the slaked lime. And slaked lime comes from calcium carbonate, okay? And calcium carbonate, is there enough calcium carbonate to imagine such a kind of incredible, huge challenge? Yes, the answer is yes. The availability of pure carbonate is very large. The outcrop area in the planet is about 4.1 million of square kilometers, and there is no constraint on abundance. And if you go into detail, within 10 kilometers from the coastline, which is the most interesting part of the geography for deployment in the ocean, of course, we have where we have bare ground, so we don't damage the vegetation and so on. We have about 11,000 gigatons of limestone. That is largely 100 times larger quantity than we should need, okay? So there is really no point about worrying about that. It's the only thing that we don't worry about. We worry about a lot of other things, but not that one, okay? Global limestone production is very high, and I want to go into some other details now. Why limestone could be better than other things? Actually, we don't know yet, but, because of course, we are working on that. But the advantage of limestone is that is already produced in a large quantity. There is no constraint about abundance, so it could be, you know, increased the production at the order, at the scale that is needed. On the contrary, if you go into magnesium, calcite, or dolomite, or olivine, or other minerals, they are produced in a 1/100th of that. So the increase of the production in the order of magnitude that is needed for having an impact on a global scale could be a problem, let's say, is not likely. It's economical, well, it requires a lot of effort, okay? Another few words, if I have time. Yeah. May I?
Yes,
okay.
please.
Okay, in theory, there is a publication probably some years ago, a couple of years ago. It is already old, you know, because things are growing and we are understanding things very fast. This publication was calculating that in theory we have 2 moles of CO2, it means 2 units of carbon dioxide that are absorbed for each unit of slaked lime that is used. Then you have to reduce a little bit because the process is not effective 100%, so you have to reduce something of that. It means that more or less you need 1.6 tons of calcium carbonate to remove 1 ton of CO2. This is the order of magnitude. So we are talking of really a big effort, right. A big economic and social whatever endeavor, but it's feasible. The numbers are there. So again, a lot of study, a lot of research is required.
Nicola, what are the biggest challenges for you to make your technology work large scale, like at these proportions that Danielle is talking about?
Yes, so I think on that point, so the potential is huge. I think we all understand that. It's a natural carbon sink. Again, it's abiotic, but it's a natural carbon sink because the underlying mechanisms that are those that store essentially 27% of our carbon emissions each year, right? So I think what's the underlying belief here is that we cannot leave out what's the biggest carbon sink and biggest carbon reservoir out of climate solution, which simply don't make sense at all. And that being said, there's a number of things that need to be considered within OAE specifically and within the broader scope of CDR, because OAE is only one part of what the full scope of potential CDR solutions. And of course on that, essentially what's interesting with CDR is essentially it's a depollution activity, right? So there are some people paying for CDR today on the voluntary carbon market, but what's truly needed is political commitment to depollute essentially. And we are seeing that actually it's actually moving pretty fast. Coming from the shipping industry, it's been moving way slower on that side. But last month in Europe, for the first time, they set what's called twin targets. So essentially one goal for emissions reduction and one goal for removal that are separate, but each of them with a specific number. And so we need this kind of initiatives, more of them, in order to get more of a firm market and scale our solutions.
And if I've understood correctly, your solution takes the acid from the wastewater to make it alkaline, but then what do you do with the acid?
Yes, so what we do is so again, there are a variety of solutions. There's about a dozen companies globally working on that side. It's very interesting to hear different considerations. But so on one part is what we call the application of alkalinity, so what type of alkalinity, where, etc. And on the other side is the process side. How do we generate alkalinity in a net negative manner? So we've been focusing on that internally and partnering with research institution on the application side. But we truly believe that if we are to scale CDR at the scales that are needed, we cannot be generating any waste. So we built our process from day one not to generate any waste product.
Doug, I want to get back to something that you touched on a bit more about the fact that's very important for OAE research, in fact, for any kind of commercial applications, is that they're viable, right? Is that there's monitoring, there's reporting, there's verification. So how can we know that OAE is going to work without any unintended negative consequences?
Well, I mean, you could just say, well, our current understanding of how the ocean works says it will be so. Now, I'm just looking around the panel, and I'm pretty sure I've probably been in this business longer than anybody else. I don't think anybody's going to argue. So the one thing I've learned is that's a mistake to say that. The ocean is always full of surprises, actually, and we actually often fool ourselves about how much we understand about the ocean. It's not a massive thought, but it's an important one. So my feeling on this is, how do you know if the process is viable? Right now, all indications are that it probably is, with a lot of caveats about how do you source the alkalinity. But then really to make progress forward, I don't think there's any alternative to learning by doing. And that means by conducting pilot scale experiments in mesocosms and then in real world situations like our very big mesocosm in Bedford Basin. You know, that's where you start to test the limits of your understanding. And that work has to be done, probably has to be done in partnership with the private sector, but not for the private sector, independent of. It's very important, but in partnership. And then it has to combine, in a much deeper way than we've ever done before, observational, experimental work with modeling. And those fields aren't always as well connected in our science disciplines as they should be. On a global scale, there's reasons why they can't be, because the ocean's just too big. But on the regional pilot scale, they can be, and that's one thing we really think we're making progress with in Bedford Basin. And it's actually both instructive, you learn a lot, and it's actually also fun as well. Shouldn't say that maybe, but actually combining perspectives from modeling and observation. But I think that's how we test whether the process can be viable, is by doing.
Mm-hmm. Rob, for the general public, the whole concept of OAE is still pretty new. I guess my question is are you worried about, or do you think it could be difficult to be accepted from a cultural standpoint or a social standpoint? I mean, you say to someone, we're going to take all this rock out and dump it in the ocean. I mean, that's something people can see, that they might, say, oh, that's just like mining coal. I mean, are there ethical considerations around this? What are your thoughts on that, on acceptability, ethical considerations, and also if the research is inclusive, leaving no one behind?
I mean, short answer, yes, absolutely. If we think of the first ocean fertilization experiment that happened in, I think, 2007 with Planktos, that created and set back a lot of the research at that time. And I think that's important, sort of going back to what Doug just said now. It's as necessary as it is for science to move into the real world. It's just as necessary, unfortunately, for scientists to balance that with what that may mean if you set back research that may now be helpful, but then sort of, setting it back as many years as that. So a word that's been thrown around today on the previous panel, and a word that's necessary to be thrown around is transparency. I think any bit of research, including OAE, it's no different. We need to be transparent about the results. That means good and bad. Everything needs to be transparent. And that means engaging with local communities. So as far as that goes, you want to build long-term trust. So I think in building that long-term trust, you need to, in our understanding, or trying to foster our understanding of what this means, we need to make sure that we're including local communities and how we build knowledge, including the public and how they feel about things. So it means that we need to, the only way you do that correctly is by having various stakeholders involved. So we need to speak to the public, we need to speak to fishers, we need to speak to scientists, we need to speak to policymakers. All of them need to come to the same table, and it's these different knowledges, these different perspectives on things that will allow a more inclusive sort of picture of everything. I don't have a quick answer for how this is done, but it could be, you know, co-designing research agendas. It could involve setting up participatory risk assessments where you're involving everybody. Funding is a big thing, because if you're going to start including local communities, of course, researchers need to have access to the sorts of funding. So inclusive research and integration, you know, it needs to be at the top of the list, just as scientists are wanting to find out the chemical and physical aspects of the research. These things need to be working in tandem with that. So I think, last but not least, I think we should also mention the fact that our engagement with this research should not be imposed. I think when we're thinking of local communities, if you're thinking of Halifax is not all too far away from certain indigenous populations. So we need to realize that as researchers, you're bringing in something new, and it's not that we should go in expecting these communities to just accept it or to unfairly expect them to accept it. Rather, we should say, yeah, something new. How do we include you? How do we build capacity in actually accepting this? That would be some of the things that I think are going to be very relevant.
So Rob, you and Jean-Pierre and Daniela, you're some of the 50 co-authors on a guide to best practices for OAE research that was released at COP28. Daniela, tell us a bit more about why there was a need for such a guide and how this guide can help make sure that OAE research is transparent.
Yes. Well, the guide was a big collective effort, and it was a great product. And we hope that you know, it will stay like a first step. And of course, research is going on. I mean, research and scientific advancement is an iterative process. You have an idea, you have to test it, then you publish your result, and then someone else say, okay, these results are not convincing me, I want to try again. And maybe the result is different because he's changing something, or maybe they are improving something, so the result will be better. This is the process of science going ahead. I mean, the guide was incredibly needed because in few years we saw a rapidly increasing research effort, and startups were growing, they were burning, and developing, and there was a need to understand how to test in a proper way that it was working really correctly without harm and so on. So in order to do that, the first answer for scientists is publish. You have to publish, you have to talk to each other and say, okay, sit down and write down what we understood up to now. And I remember there was some interesting, situation. We were maybe writing each other, writing some chapter, some contributions. And one maybe was asking, are you sure that this is the definitive and correct and perfect answer? We don't know. Yeah. That's the point. So we are always improving. Right. I always say to my students, if Linnaeus was perfectly right, nothing was happened since then, So we are always going ahead. So this was incredibly needed in order to start to convey the message that there was a body of knowledge, a small but solid body of knowledge, of experience already there. So don't waste your time to try in a completely different way because someone else already did, and we know that this is completely wrong and this other can be promising. This was the basic idea. So we did it. And, it was really a kind of timely, a concentrated knowledge-sharing exercise. That's
and evolving, I'm assuming,
yeah,
too.
And evolving, of course. Yeah, this is a starting point.
Right. Thank you for that. All right, we're going to open it up to your questions. Does anybody have any? Yes, right here. Can we have a microphone? Voilà, juste ici. Le monsieur dans le deuxième, voilà. OK.
Hello? OK. My question is linked to the effort needed to finance those big massive trial, which need to demonstrate not only the scientific carbon sink, but also ability to achieve MVR, so measurement, verification, and reporting. to give credibility to the end, and the end to the financial community, which are going to invest in this. And also, I would say also, not only the scientific and the carbon sink, but also the side benefit for the economies, because we need to involve the local community. So also the experiment should also quantify the positive side effect for the local community. And this is going to be potentially a massive effort, a massive positive benefit, considering that we need to sequestrate, remove from the atmosphere 10 gigatons. If you multiply by $100 per ton, is at 1 trillion economy per year. It's as big as the whole US telecom industry. So it is a tremendous opportunity for jobs, for economic growth. So what is the amount of money which is needed to do the trials? And who is going to put this money to finance?
So I think those are valid points. I mean, first of all, I don't know the answer to that question. It's a lot, if that's okay. But I can share the experience of how we did the initial trials, which are still, they're 20 tons a day is not nothing, but they're still relatively small scale compared to the very large numbers if you went to real scale. So we could not have done, we at a university, we could not have done that field trial. We didn't add the alkalinity. That was done by our private sector partner. They sourced the alkalinity, they figured out how to dose it, they did all of that side of things. We worked in partnership where we then measured, not for them, we weren't doing environmental monitoring, we were doing research in the context of a field study they did. But that work would not have been possible without, on the industry side, the private sector, their investor, are investing in them, and that allowed them to source the alkalinity. And for us, we relied actually on a philanthropic foundation, Carbon to Sea, who funded most of our research. We did have some traditional government-sourced research funding, but that would have only got us a very small amount of way. So really, these new sources of funding for the challenge are unavoidable. They have to be there, otherwise we can't do the science at scale. But they also bring those ethical issues. You have to sort out who you're working for and what you're doing and why when you start doing this. It's a new world for us.
So you think that philanthropy and foundations are enough to fund these trials, or do you need public money?
Well, it wouldn't have been enough to actually get the trial done. That required the private sector investment in the Canadian startup company Planetary Technologies. Now, maybe a philanthropist could have, that scale could have done it, but not for very long. So we needed both, and I do want to point out at least, if it's okay to say this, the traditional funding agencies are rather slow. They're very relatively inflexible, and so we're able to proceed quickly because of these alternative funding sources. Hopefully the government funding sources will speed up a little bit.
Alexandra.
Yes. I wanted to just react to a point in that question, which, and I think also was perhaps brought up by Daniela, this idea that we need 10 gigatons of CDR. I would really push back on that because numbers like those come up, okay, perhaps they're in the IPCC, but there are a number of different scenarios that are put in there, and that's why it's so important that these scenarios that are being put in the IPCC and then have a narrative impact of saying we need this amount of CDR, that is a societal choice. There are a number of scenarios to reach net zero that imply steep emission cuts, and hence we would need only about 1.7 to 3 gigatons of CO2 removal by 2050. And those same scenarios, if we're reducing emissions drastically now, for instance, by phasing out fossil fuels, that has really feasible side benefits in terms of health benefits of all the people who are dying already from air pollution. So I think it's really essential, and I'm learning by doing here, to really think about the bigger picture, because again, I think there's a limited pot of money in the world, and we really need to ask the question of why are we prioritizing perhaps new solutions like CDR, when in reality there's such a difficulty to put funding in the actual renewable energy, etc. right now. So right sizing and keeping the big picture in mind, I think, is essential. Thanks.
Daniela?
Yeah, thank you for saying that, because it's really the core of the problem. I mean, I think that we have to diversify our solutions. The first solution is to reduce emission, for sure. We cannot do nothing if we ignore that. We have to reduce emissions. Then we can work all together in different solutions. There will be probably a portfolio of different solutions, and each of them will be better in a certain place. I was discussing with some of the present people here about other solutions that have been found around the planet that can be locally the best, locally. So the point is that we are talking about globally scalable solution, such as maybe, hopefully, ocean liming, and local solution that can be the best here and there. And all together are adding to the amount of carbon dioxide that we'll be able to remove. I think, you know, I was present before to the previous, with the previous panel that were talking about blue carbon, and someone was correctly underlying the fact that also blue carbon is a perfect solution apparently, but is not enough to reach our final target. Yes, but this is a nice piece, then you have a nice piece, me, I can have another nice piece, and altogether maybe we can reach the target with first reduction of emissions.
Thank you, Daniela. We just have a few minutes left for maybe one last question. Jana?
I would like to challenge the statement that we have enough limestone available to do large-scale alkalinity enhancement. According to the IPCC, the ocean is taking up 2.1 gigatons CO2 annually. In order to counterbalance the acidification that it's causing, we would need roughly 21 gigatons calcium carbonate annually to put into the sea. We cannot put it as a rock. We need to grind it down to really small grains
Powder.
and to put it into the deep sea in order to dissolve. It takes thousands of years. Plus, imagine how much 21 gigatons calcium carbonate are. These are roughly 60 cubic kilometers. You have seen the rocks that surround us in Monaco. There are limestone rocks. And at some point, they are 1,000 meters high. So this one rock where the military station is on the top. Imagine a coastal strip in 6 kilometers length, 1 kilometer height, 1 kilometer inland, every year to grind down and put into the sea. But not all limestone is close to the coast. You have to bring it from inland, you have to mine it, to grind it down. The carbon footprint you create by just making this into powder and putting it into the sea, just that, I don't think it's feasible. And I also, just as one moment, I miss a little bit.
Keeping an eye on the time, Jana.
Yes. I miss a little bit the impact on the marine ecosystem. So the opinion of ecologists, marine biologists on the alkalinity enhancement. Thank you.
Daniela, speak about the limestone. Then Alexandra, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah.
Or who wants?
Thank you for your consideration. Anyway, there have been calculation on that. You know that the present day production is 6.6 gigatons per year of limestone production. And the problem is not, the grinding of the limestone. The true problem is the calcination, that you need to transform the calcium carbonate into calcium hydroxide. That this is the true delicate point. But this also has been taken into account making the calculation. And it looks that, of course, we have to balance the cost, what we produce and what we take out. And at the end, it's a good negative kind of solution. So negative emission can be reached in this way. And the calcium carbonate is not a limiting factor. Yeah, for sure. This is numerically proven.
Doug.
Very quickly on ecosystem impacts. Of course, I mean, it's easy just to be facile and say, of course, we should study it. Of course, this is new land as well. And so, you know, in the context of learning by doing, in such pilot scale experiments, which are still substantial scale. You start with mesocosms, and then you have to go to pilot scale. So far, we have been looking at phytoplankton populations, the microbial community. Again, we benefit from we're doing this in a place where we have a lot of knowledge of natural variability, and so far, we've not seen anything, but that doesn't mean there isn't something lurking around the corner that you haven't thought about. So this relates again to the transparency of the research. I personally think doing the research in a place where the public has full view is a good idea, as opposed to going away on a ship somewhere and putting something in the ocean where nobody can see what you're doing. Do it where people can see you doing it, and be open. These pilot studies, or test beds, whatever you call them, they have to be open to anybody, I would argue, to conduct research in the context, so that you might be focusing on this impact over here, but somebody says, what about that? And they then have the opportunity to look at that. So it's a different way of doing science, not holding it close to ourselves, but opening it up to the community, but to other scientists as well. My personal opinion is the risk is not high compared to the risk of doing nothing, but that's just my personal opinion. What does that matter?
Doug, thank you so much. I'm so sorry. We'll have to leave it there. We're going to take the room for another event, and we have one more speaker. So let's just give a round of applause to our panel. Thank you so much. It was fantastic. As they're coming down, let me just introduce our next speaker. We're going to wrap up with some comments on CDR and on the international climate negotiations. Would you please welcome Christelle Chanteloube? She is the head of division and national focal point to UNFCCC at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation for the Government in Monaco. Christelle? Sure. Yes, please. Thank you.
How can it? Yeah, it's working. Yeah. So, good afternoon, everyone, and I'm very honored to have been invited to pronounce a few closing remarks after what has been such an incredibly rich debate. And I'm sure that everyone has learned a lot about the technicalities and the complexities as well of marine CDR. So it's not easy to take the floor after such eminent panelists, but at least I'm going to try to share my experience as a COP negotiator for Monaco, to give you insights about the place of CDR and blue carbon as part of international climate negotiations, and more generally to present Monaco's official stance on these topics. So as we've heard very often this afternoon, CDR has gained a lot of momentum in the last years, and even the IPCC has posited that we will need some sort of CDR to reach the targets set in the Paris Agreement. It is a controversial topic that is debated as part of climate negotiations, and from the outset, I would like to make it clear that the position of the government of Monaco is that these measures should only come as a complement to drastic emission reduction measures. And this has been highlighted again during the last panel. We know they can and will certainly be an important piece of the puzzle, but they should not be used as an excuse to delay the necessary action to transform our economies and our models. And in that sense, I would echo Alexandre Desprez's statement on the fact that CDR shouldn't be used as a distraction. Another point that is worth mentioning and that we highlighted also in the last panel is the energy efficiency of these technologies. That should be clarified, bearing in mind that today nearly 80% of the global energy production comes from fossil fuels. So there's no sense in storing CO2 using a large amount of grey energy or fuel. That being said, it's particularly interesting and important to have an open and frank debate about the options on the table. And this event, the organization of this event is truly commendable because we've had a real exchange about different approaches to marine CDR. So to tell you a little bit more about the positions that the government of Monaco is defending as part of the climate negotiations under the impulse of His Serene Highness Prince Albert II, we have always been strong advocates of nature-based solutions. And we're always trying to promote synergies between the different international frameworks, whether they are climate, ocean, or biodiversity related. And as recently as last COP, COP28 in Dubai, His Serene Highness Prince Albert II, as well as our Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation, actively participated in high-level events and debates to push for the inclusion of the ocean in the results of the global stocktake, the first global stocktake of the Paris Agreement. And this was also made with a view to better aligning the climate process with the global biodiversity framework and the BBNJ Treaty. Generally, we believe that it's particularly important to have a positive narrative about the ocean, and not only to present it as a victim of climate change, but also as a source of solutions. And so this is a message that we've been actively disseminating since at least COP21, 2015, where we united with a group of leading countries to really make sure that this ocean climate nexus was recognized and that we can work on the tangible solutions offered by the ocean as well. And blue carbon, as we've understood, is one of these solutions. So as a government, we're really committed to safeguarding and restoring these ecosystems. And just to give you a few examples of how we walk the talk, on the political front, we're part of the International Partnership for Blue Carbon, and also of the High-Level Ambition Group on Blue Carbon alongside countries such as France or Costa Rica. But we are also dedicated to advancing this topic on the ground, and so we are or have been funding several blue carbon related projects that are boasting mitigation as limited as they can be, adaptation and biodiversity co-benefits. And we also recently have been working with IUCN to explore the potential for restoring and safeguarding blue carbon ecosystems in the Mediterranean. So we're looking for scaling up projects in the Mediterranean. Coming back to the place of blue carbon in climate negotiations, place of blue carbon in climate negotiations. It's interesting to note actually that blue carbon was one of the selected topics as part of the last year's UNFCCC Ocean and Climate Change Dialogue held in Bonn last June. So that is a positive signal, and also notable are the encouraging messages that have been anchored in the global stocktake decision at last COP28 in Dubai, where parties are again encouraged to enhance ocean-based climate action. So what does it mean? It means including the ocean in their NDCs, in their national adaptation plans, in their national climate strategies. So that's also an incentive to break the silos between the international climate efforts and the ocean conservation efforts. When it comes to ocean alkalinity enhancement, we have not formulated any specific position yet. However, precaution has always guided our stance towards geoengineering in general. So obviously, we're particularly committed to safeguarding environmental integrity. And what's interesting to note is that the name of our negotiation group as part of the climate negotiations is the Environmental Integrity Group. So we are really pushing this message forward and trying to avoid any harm to the environment. And these positions have been voiced in different fora, not only the UNFCCC, but also the UN Environment Programme at the last two UN Environment Assemblies. In that sense, we're strong supporters of science, supporters of science-based decision-making, and on the precise matter, as we've heard again this afternoon, we believe more research is needed to really achieve a comprehensive assessment of both the environmental and social impacts of these technologies before they are deployed on a large scale. And that is the reason why we think that publications like these Guide to Best Practices for OAE Research are particularly welcome because they help frame and facilitate this research that is so much needed and to ensure that it is conducted in a responsible and transparent manner as well. And eventually, the scientific understanding will help facilitate responsible governance on an international scale. So to conclude, I'd like to reaffirm the government's support to the OASIS initiative. We're very proud to be a partner of OASIS alongside other distinguished stakeholders, and we hope it will continue its excellent work as demonstrated again this afternoon by the level and the richness of the debate that we've had the opportunity to attend. Thank you very much.
Crystal, thank you so much for that. Thank you to all of you for joining us today for this special Oasis event, looking at carbon dioxide removal from blue carbon to OAE. A lot of exciting discussions here that will continue at the One Ocean Science Congress in Nice, which is happening just before the UN Oceans Conference in June 2025. And with that, I wish you a wonderful rest of your evening. Please, if you could leave the room as quickly as possible. There's another event coming right after. Monaco Ocean Week's very busy. There's a lot happening. Be sure to check out the website to go find the next exciting activity. Thank you so much. Have a good night.